I want to be a kitty with a tail long and pretty to wag and wave and swing. With a silky fur coat to keep me warm in the cold. It is my dearest wish. I could maybe be white, perhaps black as night, a tabby or a calico, or a brindled beauty, sable, fawn, and orange, or red, gray, brown, or gold.
How did you become a folk musician?
Well, I lived in the Bay Area. I lived in Berkeley, and you couldn't get away from music in Berkeley. My real interest is classical music, but I've never devoted any real time to it. I've always, from the time I could play something, I've always played guitar at first, and auto harp, kazoo, anything I could pick up and play that was simple, I played. I didn't play horns and I didn't play whistles and things, but mainly strings. I worked for John Lundberg in Berkeley, and of course that gave me an exposure to a lot of people who played music, folk music and rock and roll and things. Here comes Daisy, my best friend. Mm-hmm. So my interest in music started fairly early on. Also, don't forget that I used to collect old recordings, and I heard a lot of music as a younger person, and I never dreamed I would ever play music. Why would I dream that? But when it came time to play music, a lot of that listening that I did as a kid came out, and I was able to basically incorporate that into my background thinking.
What was, do you remember the moment that you decided that you really wanted to play?
Well, I used to go to the Cabal. It was a coffee house in Berkeley started by Rolf Kahn in the late 50s. And if you played, you got in free, and they even gave you a pastry. So I would get up on the stage and do what little I knew how to do, and no one cared. They were smoking cigarettes, drinking coffee, and talking to each other. And the music was nonstop, and when you were done, someone else got up there and played. So I'd sort of drifted into it. And as far as playing the accordion, my friend Mira May asked me to take care of her little Hohner button accordion, a 2815 it was, poker work gold and black, while she went to Europe. So I had never thought of playing the accordion, but I worked at that while she was gone, and by the time she got back and wanted it back, I could play halfway decently, and I ended up with one of my own.
Had you played harmonica before that?
Well, I had played harmonica before that, in fact, and I'm sure that stood me in good stead, although I've never thought about it before.
When you were a kid, you were in a show business family. Can you tell us a little bit about your childhood?
Or dad?
Yeah, well, my dad was the head flying monkey in the movie Wizard of Oz. And as such, he was an extra and, what do they call them, when the stunt man. And so, but I never went on the set or anything like that. My dad compartmentalized his life extremely well, and I never spent any time with showbiz people or anything. Of course, there was no television then, and didn't listen to the radio very much. So really, I had no musical input as a little kid at all. Mm-hmm. And as far as showbiz is concerned, my mom was just a housewife. Neither parents seemed to be musical at all, although my dad used to sing a few songs that he knew. Always Chasing Rainbows, that was one of them. Yeah, well, that was kind of the story of my dad's life, always chasing rainbows.
You've had a long history of repairing the accordion. Can you tell me about how that you started doing that and some of the interesting things that are brought into your life, both with people and learning how to do all this.
Accordions are machines, and as such, they suffer breakdowns in a way that most other instruments don't. Even pianos, if properly maintained, go on for years without even changing strings, but accordions suffer from all kinds of ongoing problems, and as such, I learned how to repair my own accordions. Word got around, and people had me repair their instruments for them.
Where did you kind of go from learning how to tweak your own accordions just to make them work to being one of the more experts I knew about repairing accordions?
It was organic.
What was organic?
Oh, repairing accordions was organic. I did it for myself for years because there was no one else I knew who was doing it, although that was my narrow viewpoint. There are, of course, there have been lots of people through the years who repaired them. But I never heard of any because I led a very insular life after a while, living out in the country with no real input except my own playing and thinking. No one I knew played the accordion in any form of that instrument whatsoever, and it wasn't until many years later that I even met anyone who played accordion, and even then it wasn't piano accordions, it was button accordions. Mm-hmm. First one person and then others. And of course, after a while, I heard of Cajun music and noticed that they had an accordion player playing. But really, it's just like many things in my life, it just accrued over time until I was repairing instruments for other people, as there were other people to repair instruments for. I've always had a very eclectic viewpoint on music, and I've always just played the tunes that hit me that I wanted to learn how to play. I don't know any great body of music that I play as such. A lot of people seem to play Irish music or English music or French music. I've always done it tune by tune. If I hear a tune on a recording, I want to learn it. The first tune I ever learned, especially on the accordion, was a tune called Ruach na Marku, which is an 80 RPM recording that I had that was labeled as a polyglot accordion duet. And it's a Landler, Ruach na Marku, from, from Bohemia. That's what it's from. Yeah. And it just went on from there.
I was wondering how you got exposed to French music, because you're one of the most wonderful players of the Auvergne music. You and Alan together on the bagpipes, it was fabulous what you guys did, Martin Kyla stuff, and I wonder when you got into that.
Alan Keith lived in Santa Rosa, and I knew him from somewhere. I don't even remember how I met him. But at one point, he got very interested in French music and had many recordings of Martin Kyla. Also, Bob Thomas, the bagpiper, knew a lot of older French tunes and had some recordings of some of the older people playing. I've always been much more interested in the old people's playing rather than in my contemporaries. Very interested in antiquarian recordings and music to the almost exclusion of modern players. So I heard a lot of recordings of Martin Kyla particularly, but José Roux also, who was his protege, I suppose you'd say. And I just learned off of recordings mostly. I've never been anywhere in my life particularly. So I've learned I've learned off of recordings, and I've done a certain amount of composing. As a kid, I was raised up in a city, parts of Los Angeles. I was born in Hollywood. I lived in Hollywood as a little kid, and West Los Angeles and Santa Monica and Venice and Ocean Park and places of that ilk. And my life has been spent in moving northward. Bakersfield for a while, then the Bay Area, and then out of the Bay Area I moved to Lagunitas, and then Pen Grove up near Santa Rosa, and then to Cloverdale, and then finally to the Mendocino coast. And I've been a lot of other places in America, but as far as living somewhere, that's kind of the way it went. So, and I prefer to live in a countrified place. I don't need to be totally primitive, but I live in places where in the winter I haven't had to worry about slipping in ice and snow. I don't mind rain, but no ice and snow. So it's always been in fairly temperate climates. But I prefer living somewhat countrified. The more people I'm around, the less comfortable I am. And I really prefer, for many years in fact, I've lived completely on my own, and there have been long periods where I never saw anyone at all. So the life I'm leading now is a little different than what I'm used to. You're getting older, you know, and needing some support help just to do certain physical things, and then not getting around as well as I did. There have to be people around me, but as far as my druthers are concerned, I like living an almost hermit-like existence. I like being able to be off on my own, but I also do like getting together with other people, particularly to play music. So I like what you might call a party kind of life, but I also like to be able to go somewhere where I am on my own and not forced to be around other people if I don't wish to be. But yes, I'm gregarious and outgoing. I don't know, you know, like a lot of people, my life is a big mass of contradictions. Well, as a kid, I lived in private schools away from my parents. Both my parents were in the military. The Second World War was on, so I lived in a series of cheap private schools. God help anyone who has to do that. But eventually, the war was over. I lived with my mother, and there were huge polio epidemics at the time in Los Angeles. 1948 and 9 were big ones. My mother was a nurse at a polio hospital, Cabot Kaiser Institute, down at the beach in Santa Monica. And I was playing with another boy one day, and we went up in a storm drain that came out at the foot of Pico Boulevard there. And the next day, we both came down with polio. And they understand now that water is one of the major vectors for polio, but it was not well understood then. So there I was, quarantined at Queen of Angels Hospital in Los Angeles with the boiling hot wool blankets. I can't stand the smell of hot, wet wool to this day. And lying there screaming as the orderlies mercilessly wrapped us up in these hot wool blankets. And because I'd already had polio, a few years later, when the second epidemic hit, 1954, I was 16 then, and my mother asked the doctors, hey, does he need polio vaccine? It had just come out. They told her, no, he's already had polio. So I got polio again. I'm famous in the literature, at least I was, one of about, 2 or 3 or 4 people that had ever had polio twice. I guess I'm just lucky. And as far as living an independent life, I think that a lot of my character, such as it is, has been molded by my lessened mobility and the necessity in my life of every day overcoming something, just overcoming. A lot of people don't think how they live. They don't think how they move. They don't think what their life is like and reaching for something, or if they're going to fall down when they're trying to do something. I've had to pay very close attention to what I do all the time, and it's created a certain way of thinking, of being careful and learning how to do things without being pretentious, I hope. I'd say in a way it's almost a Zen-like state in that I have to pay very close attention, more than I would certainly want to in the normal scheme of life. But it's also fostered an independence in me. I suppose a necessity of proving to myself that I can do things for myself. But maybe that's just my nature as an adult. Hard to say, because since I was crippled as a kid, I don't know what a normal adult life is like, except by observing my friends and others. I'd say that because of having to be careful and having to pay attention, I've never really thought about this before, but the truth is, I think that it has made my life to some extent what it is, both to myself and in the view of people around me. Paying attention to the little details. I have to be careful, in fact, that I don't just pay so close attention to the little details that I end up not having a wider view of things. It's a kind of a dichotomy between moving this little muscle and performing this little activity and seeing the outcome, and in having a wider, more philosophical and practical view of the life that we live, not only within myself, within ourselves, but in the grand scheme of things. What is society and what makes it work and what our places are in it. I've always, well, I hope, maybe not always, but I've always tried, and God knows, to be a responsible human being, because responsibility is what makes you an adult. Even if you're 10 years old, if you are responsible, you're an adult. That's what makes it you an adult. And God knows I've been very irresponsible in my life, but I've tried and I've worked at it. And here we are now. The shame of it for me, if there is something like that, a regret possibly, is that I'm learning what it means to be a creature on this planet. I don't want to say human being, because I have too much respect for all the creatures on this planet. I have 4 cats at this point, and they and many other animals, creatures on this planet, have taught me so much about their lives and about their place and my place with them and among my own kind. And we get too old, smart, we get, what is this saying? We get too soon old and too late smart, I think is the saying. So if I have any regrets, is that I probably won't live long enough to learn what I see now is worth learning. I'm not talking about languages and things like that, God knows, or how to write a better poem. I'd like to improve my music, of course, but just how to exist without negatively impacting the creatures, human and otherwise, around me. And more than that, possibly how to make my life and their lives easier, because no one's got an easy life. No one at all. And as for our four-footed friends, they're in a tough bind. I've been depressed during periods of my life, or moments in my life, certainly, very depressed possibly, but there's always been something in me that has fought unconsciously, not even consciously, fought something that seems to destroy other people. What happens with me is I get angry when I get frustrated and upset about what I have to go through in life. That's Bobby Lee, one of my cat friends, going meow for you people. And so the frustrations, and also, you know, it's what we go through on a daily basis. Really, that's no one, I really feel this is true. I was raised up by old-fashioned parents who didn't talk about their problems, and I don't talk about them much either. It's my business, and I try to go through life without putting my business on other people. The thing that happens once in a while is that suddenly I'll start swearing at something now, more particularly now because I'm not used to handling a wheelchair, and it's taking me a while to learn how to utilize it very well. So every once in a while, the swear words come out, but really I don't know, just generally I've never felt particularly sorry for myself. I think I've been too busy just trying to live an average life.
What was your inspiration for the Kitty songs?
My inspiration for the Kitty songs was the cats themselves. I've had several cats through the years, and finally I met Daisy Dickens, who is one of my best friends, and she had 3 kittens, Aostra, Sylvan, and Joao. So then there were the 4 of us, and I had 2 cats before that, and then another cat since then too. And when Aostra died young, I started putting this project together. It's kind of been an off and on thing for several years to come up with the cat songs and to commemorate them in some way, because they're not going to be around forever, and I'm not either. When I first got Daisy, in fact, she's sitting on the bed and I'm standing there, and she's a young kitten. She's about a year old. And I look at her and I said, "Oh, Daisy, I'll be so sorry when you go west." That's an old-fashioned take on dying. And she said, you can believe me if you want to or not, well, JP, I might live longer than you do. And of course, that was a revelation too, because I was 63 or 4 years old, and I still hadn't really thought about dying yet. Well, I've been crippled since I was very young, since I was 11 years old, and more so after I was 16. But I just lived my life, and I was what I was for so long that I didn't even think about it after a while. But more recently, and it creeps up on everyone sort of like this, suddenly I was old. I would have to say that I was 20 years old till the time I was 60. And then suddenly maybe I was 40 or so. But at another point, my abilities to get around and to do certain things started to fail, and all of a sudden I was not only crippled, but I was older and crippled, and it added up to something that, as I look around me, not very many people have had to go through. Some people are crippled, but I don't particularly know them as old people. A lot of cripples die young. They just fade away for various reasons, including maybe ennui and sadness. But a lot of people, well, most people get old, but they're not crippled. They still get along. I know a couple of people who are in their 90s, and they're doing pretty damn good, but I'll never be one of those, because at this point, I can't walk. I can't even stand up, really. So I'm having to face old and crippled, which is kind of a double whammy, and I'm not playing on that, but it's a reality. One day at Lark Camp, it's a music camp put on at the Mendocino Woodlands, I'm standing on the lower road, and my friend David Brown came up to me. He reminded me of this recently. And I yelled over to him. He wasn't real close, but he was approaching. David, do you want to see my impersonation of a drunk cripple? And I think he answered in the affirmative. So I threw my walking sticks out to one side and threw myself down on the ground. I think that was the beginning of our friendship. I'm glad he reminded me of that. That was a pretty funny moment. These moments of humor are one of the things that make us human. You show me a person without humor, and they do some pretty inhuman things, but the ones with humor, they know how to be human. They can be human. I was born in 1938, and life then, I remember it fairly well as a young person, was very different than it is now. There were fewer than half the number of people on this planet, and things were very different. We had streetcars, a wonderful form of transportation, wonderful and awe-inspiring, really, some of those big red cars where the wheels were as tall as I am. And the way of life, the war had come to an end, and people pulled together. And that is my view in my youth. And I really find it unfortunate that at this point, people don't pull together anymore. They don't go to mutual entertaining things like nightclubs. Television put an end to that. 1949, suddenly everyone had a TV, and no one went out to nightclubs or public places anymore. They became insulated in their own homes. And frankly, I've always wanted to live in a fairly utopian place where people related to each other and lived in a way that some of the wonderful things that we used to have, we could still have. if we must have automobiles, what about some of those wonderful old clanking motor cars that were so funny? You know, it's like maybe Monty Python or some of those early English films about involving early day transport. Old trains that were chuffed and puffed, and streetcars that got you where you were going, and neighborhoods that were real neighborhoods. So in that regard, although it's hard to pick and choose, to tell you the truth, the only way that I could have lived in a previous time would have been not as a cripple, and I've been crippled most of my life. So if I think about living in some possibly previous time, I don't think about the future so much because we don't know about it, and also we seem to be giving away our birthright as fast as we can. So I think about living in the past. I suppose I would have liked to have been born maybe somewhere about 1910 or so, or a little bit before that, so I wouldn't have been involved in the First World War, or in the Second, or in Korea, or in Vietnam, or in those wars that the U.S. government feels called upon to put its people in jeopardy with. Second World War, I can rather appreciate. They were fighting some pretty awful dictators who had things their own way in their own spheres and who might have taken over. But my view of wars is they never did anyone really any good. And society, after the wars, went through revolutions that I do not see in retrospect as being good revolutions. It made everyone hedonistic and breaking with the past in a way that was not good. Innovation is one thing, but completely breaking with the past and reinventing the wheel is something else. So I suppose I wouldn't have minded living in the 19th century or earlier in the 20th century than I live in now. Hard to say. I suppose I'm really just as happy where I am now. Music brings almost everything worthwhile to my life as far as what I could involve myself with, either playing it or listening to it. I wouldn't be here without music. It was a great mainstay when I was a kid and collected old records and heard some of the things I wouldn't have heard otherwise except in an antique way, cylinder recordings and early 20th century records. Some wonderful things, not so much folk music, but maybe more popular things, insights into a way of life that was gone. I gravitated toward classical music, and some of those composers really brought a lot of joy to life. So that when I learned to play music, although I didn't necessarily play the things that I heard on recordings, I still played music, and it was a great joy to me to hear myself and to hear other people playing. And so I'd say without music, I'd be gone by now. Music has been a wonderful thing in my life. With musicians, you don't have to like somebody to play music with them. So in that regard, I play music with a lot of people that in the average course of living one's life, one might not form a true bond of friendship with. But one has music, and that is as good a bond as any. I don't know that I am more friends with musical people than with non-musical people, but I've always gravitated toward artists of any kind, creators. They don't have to even make anything that is art with a capital A, but they have creative minds, if nothing else. And since that's true, generally they also do things that they have to show for it, musically, or written, or sculpting, or painting, or anything, pottery, any of those things. I've gravitated toward people who do things with their hands and don't just make a living sitting in an office somewhere until they turn gray and die. In my life, I've always been hampered by the government's insistence that when I receive government aid, I can't make any money doing anything. I cannot receive money doing anything I might know how to do or learn how to do, because for every dollar that I might make, they will take $1 away. So I've gotten government aid through the years, and I am very appreciative of this from the standpoint of being able to live a somewhat independent life, and am thankful to the many people who've somehow made that possible, from the social workers right on up to possibly Congress. But really, I can't make any money, or else they just take it away. So I'm stuck with this fixed income, which I think at this point might be the grand total of $879 a month, and that's extremely hard to live on. But that's what I'm doing. Because of playing music, I've been involved through the years in many situations that your average householder might not have been involved with. I've been allowed to come to various music camps through the ages of friends of mine, or maybe reading about it somewhere, and to go there. And the people I've met through the years have been a talented and somewhat humorous bunch of people. Some of my very best friends, many of whom now are gone west, of course, I've had the privilege of knowing them through the years. And there have been a lot of very humorous things, but I don't know if it's so much anecdotes as just a life, I think, well lived in a pleasant situation where humorous events can occur, and that one might notice that they're living a humorous way. One day at a LARC camp situation called Happy Hour, I was standing around with some friends, and we had a bottle of Mexican Caña. Mexican Caña is 192 proof. It's almost 100% pure cane alcohol. And so I saw a woman and her husband, my friend Ann Heyman and Charlie, approaching me, and I thought I would pull a little joke on Ann, because Ann was Irish, but she played that up, and drank, a good amount. And so I offered her the bottle, and I said, Ann, try this. And I didn't say anything about it. And the minute she put it to her lips, of course, she understood what it was. Most people who tried to drink this stuff ended up coughing and sneezing with tears coming out of her eyes. She took a big slug of this, brought the bottle down, looked at me with a big smile in her eyes, and went, that's good. She knew I dosed her, but it didn't affect her at all. I was amused and amazed, to tell you the truth.
Ostra Lightfoot, she has that bright look. Ostra Lightfoot, Delft Lily, Silver Bell. She is my Queenie, my Harry Houdini. I love my beautiful little sister evermore. Ostra Lightfoot, she has that bright look. As she prances, jumps and scoots across the floor. She is my honey, my saber-tooth buddy. I love Ostra Lightfoot evermore. I love Ostra Lightfoot evermore.